That was long ago.
I don't know. Can you request to share a PowerPoint? I think you can.
Hi all. Is the audio okay?
Happy to see an adult in the room.
It's fine.
Great, thank you. Welcome to the IETF 111 plenary. My name is Lars Eckert. I chair the IETF. This is my first plenary flying solo. I had Alyssa with me for the last one. This one is also at 2 a.m. local time for me here in Finland, and appreciate my fellow Europeans showing up as well at this time. I'll try to be fast. You guys can help being fast by not asking too many questions. And if you're asking questions, ask them concisely, and we'll try to answer them concisely. But first, we have some administrativa to go to. Can I get the next slide, please, Alexa? Right. So if you are going to speak during this meeting, it would be your audio and video will be off when you join the meet echo. You should know this by now if you've been participating during the week. You get into the queue by clicking the little hand icon. When we're acknowledging you to speak, you are welcome to unmute your microphone. You should unmute your microphone so we can hear you, but I also encourage you to share your video. It makes it much easier, especially for non-native speakers, to understand what's being said if they get a visual of the face. And if you have a headset, use one. I don't happen to have one here, but it's pretty quiet given that it's 2 a.m., so hopefully this is okay. And there's some more guidelines from Meet Echo that you may refer to if you need more information than that. I should mention also that we have a chat, as you may know. It's logged over into the Jabber system, and it gets archived together with the minutes of the meeting. So keep that in mind as you're typing away in the chat. It's actually going into the public record. And after the last meeting, we got some feedback that some comments could be misunderstood as not being very professional. So keep that in mind as you're typing away. I know everybody is sort of a little bit bored in this remote setting, and the chat sort of is the thing that makes you feel connected to the community. So feel free to use it as you will then, but keep in mind that we're archiving it. Right, we have the usual agenda here. The welcome part is what I'm trying to do right now. We have a host presentation, or at least an address from the host of the meeting, which is Juniper Networks, who have been, again, supporting us substantially for this meeting. We have the usual round of brief updates from various bodies, the ISG, I think that should say, not the IETF, the IAB, the IRTF, the RFC editor, the NOMCOM this time, and the IETF LLC board. Longer reports, written reports are available, and they're linked from the slide deck and have been emailed out to the various announcement lists. We have a special session where Jay Daly is going to talk about some results from this all of IETF survey that we emailed out to basically everybody who's subscribed to one of our mailing lists. And the results are pretty interesting. So there's a long report that I think has been announced already. I'm going to talk a little bit about the highlights, and we'd be interested in hearing your thoughts on them. And then we have the usual open mic sessions for the ISG, the IAB, and the IETF LLC. And we're going to try and do all of that and not run over. Next slide, please. Right. So again, I'd like to thank Juniper Networks, who are the host of this meeting. We really do appreciate your support, especially in these times of remote meetings where it's arguably a little bit more challenging for the host to get the full value out of supporting an organization like this. And so we're especially thankful for Juniper stepping up and hosting the meeting. As you all know, right, the IETF could not exist without support like this. And we're looking forward to working with you guys going forward. And I think we have Raj Yavatkar who would like to say a few words. Is that correct? If so, please send video and audio, Raj. Or maybe we don't. Is Raj in the list? Let me scroll down. There's too many names here. I see him.
Mic issues, Mark.
I'm sorry? So Raj might have some audio video issues. I think what we're going to do is we're going to keep going. And here he is. Raj, are you there? No, we can't hear him now. So my suggestion would be we're going to come back to Raj during the LLC part, where we're going to, again, thank Uniper from the IETF LLC, and we're going to also thank the other various sponsors that we have. Probably Raj has resolved his audio video issues by then. Can I get the next slide, please? Thank you. So thanks to Juniper again, and we're going to do that one more time later on. But also there's, as always, many other people who help make the meetings happen, even when they're all virtual. First and foremost, the Secretariat, we could not operate without them. They really support the organization. MeetEcho has provided a very flawless IETF, at least for me. I've not heard about any major issues. The new slide share functionality gets really good feedback from everybody. The NOC has been stellar as always. I've not been aware of any network-related issues. And the tools team, as always, has sort of helped us improve our tools that support both the meeting and also the ongoing work of the IETF. We had a hackathon. It's successful as always. It's unfortunately also a little bit challenging to do these hackathons in a virtual format. And we're really hoping that we can resume the in-person hackathon events, which have been excellent. But I think this hackathon has resulted in some great work as well. And I want to thank the LLC who deal with all the boring stuff. So the rest of us don't have to. Next slide, please. Right, this brings me to the IETF chair report. It's pretty short this time because we have some other presentations that we wanted to leave enough time for. Next slide. I'm going to talk a little bit about the usual participant statistics for this meeting. We have a short update on the impact of COVID-19 on the organization in terms of participation. Alvaro will talk about this. He's been in a small ISG team that crunched the numbers with help from the Secretariat. We have a consultation out that finished few days ago on guidelines and a conditional plan for meetings that are impacted by COVID. There's quite a bit of detail that came from the community, and pointers to that are coming, and they're also online. Next slide. Right, so we've had 1,369 registrations, which is a pretty strong number for an all-virtual meeting. 299 people used the fee waivers. We've offered an unlimited amount, and we didn't ask, why you needed one. So it's good to see that they're being used. We had 265 hackathon participations. That is also a great number with 18 projects being worked on. We will update these statistics as they as the week progresses and ends, and you'll get final information, I guess, in an update to this deck at some point. The participation split is slightly less European, I would say, than it normally is, based on eyeballing this, which isn't surprising given the time zones. But the way we're running these virtual meetings is that we're rotating them around the globe, and this time Europe has the unfortunate nighttime slot. It is what it is. Next slide, please. Right, and this is where I'm going to hand over to Alvaro for a second to talk about the impact of COVID-19 update. Thank you.
Thanks, Lars. We've been showing the last few plenaries some numbers around what we think is the impact of COVID-19. Basically, we're looking at mailing list messages. We're looking at the total number of drafts that have been submitted, and specifically about at the 00 drafts as well. So this table is basically a summary of the last 4 years and partially of this year. You can see the numbers from January to July. We're a little bit past the half point for the year. If you look at the projection, which is basically just an extension of what has been happening till now, we're running a little bit low. So we're running lower on everything, on mail messages, on IDs published, and of course on 00s as well. Some of these numbers are a little bit more significant percentage-wise than others. And so what I want to do is show a couple of graphs that again, we've shown before. Next slide, please. This first one shows the number of mail messages. If you look at really close, one of the lines at the top here is what 2020 looked like. And the one at the bottom that partially ends in June is the one for this year. The general trend is about the same. It goes up and down. It is lower, as I said before, what we've seen this year with respect to what we saw the last few years. It is not the lowest at this point, but it is relatively low. Next slide. This is the total number of internet drafts that have been published. Again, many of the past few years show a very similar pattern where it goes up at around the IETF meetings, 3 peaks in around March, around July, and then November. This year, which is the green line down here at the bottom, is what we've been seeing. Clearly, this line is lower. It is a little bit different at the very beginning where it starts a little bit high and then it dips down. In total, as I said before, it's a little bit lower, a few percentage points with respect to what we've seen in the last 3 or 4 years. And then next slide. Finally, this is the 00 drafts. We already saw last year that the yellow line at the bottom is last year. Last year was already running lower than the years before, 17 through 19. And the green line, which is this year, is running a little bit lower as well. Next slide. So when we look at these numbers, we can make some observations. We honestly don't know exactly why this is happening, but we can make some observations in general. Everything, as I said, in 2020 seemed broadly in line with other years. Around email and total drafts, 00 were lower. The general assumption here is that given that we're not seeing each other face to face, or even seeing our colleagues at work or customers, providers, anything like that, that some of the new ideas are, of course, lagging or lower. This seems to be sort of in line with what you could expect, if anything, from a completely online communication and no face-to-face meetings. This year, in 2021, we're seeing everything track a little bit lower. Emails, they're still sort of in line, but lower than before. And the drafts, and particularly the 00 drafts, are lower as well. One of the assumptions, of course, is that, again, because there's no face-to-face interaction, because we're not seeing each other, etc., that some of the new ideas reflected in the 00 drafts are lagging for now. So we will, of course, keep an eye on this, and we'll keep reporting. We welcome comments and ideas on what this may be the result of later on, or through email in the next few days. Back to you, Lars. Thank you.
Thanks, Alvaro. Right, so if you have questions about this, we can talk about this more during the ISG open mic session. Next slide, please. Right, planning for future meetings. As always, we have some meetings in the pipeline. There's a process that began last week with a community consultation on whether we should move IETF 112, which is the next IETF in November, which should have been or should be in Madrid, to an all-online meeting. There's a link you can click to provide your feedback, and you can also join the Many Couches IETF mailing list to discuss these topics and other related topics on future meetings. Next slide. There's a assortment of information on this page. So first of all, tools feedback. If you have any issues during the IETF, please email support@ietf.org. This is the ticket queue. It gets triaged to the correct person or organization. So any issues you have with anything related to the meeting or the IETF, support@ietf.org is your one-stop help desk. Specifically for tools, if you have feature requests, there's a tools discussed at IETF.org list. You can not only make requests there, you can also join the discussion on what should be done about them. There will be a survey after IETF 111 closes. Please fill out that survey if at all possible. It helps us, especially the LLC, get valuable information that helps us plan future meetings. And then we have the SHMU working group, which stands for Stay Home, Meet Only Online, which unfortunately met just before this plenary. That's a group that's chartered in the general area to develop guidelines for fully remote meetings like this one, specifically on what the meeting fee structure should be, how we have synchronous meetings, what the meeting cadence and length should be, how we're having a hackathon associated with those meetings. What are the considerations of canceling the meeting? And it has that bullet has a green check mark because that draft is basically done. It's ISG approved. It needs a revision, and then it'll be an RFC. And some requirements for a show of hands tool for MeetEcho. The list is the same I mentioned before. It's the many couches at IETF.org list. So it's not shmoo at IETF.org. Cunningly, it has a different name. Right, next slide, please. There's a few more topics in the online report from the ISG and the chair. The highlights are we had 0 appeals since IETF 110. We put out 5 ISG statements, which is a surprisingly large number. Several of those were sort of in the pipeline for a long time. They just happened to come out during the cycle. And there's many more details in the individual reports from the IAB, the LLC board, the Secretariat, and IANA. And there's an IETF blog where the comms team blogs about ongoing events and technological developments. So if you haven't checked that out, you should. There's every few weeks, I think, another interesting article being published. Next slide, please. Right, and that brings us to the brief report from the IAB. Miriam.
Yeah, hello everybody, and we can go to the next slide and skip that one as well. Yeah, so this is a very brief report. As always, the extended report has been uploaded to the proceedings, so you can click on this link and see all the nitty-gritty, interesting admin details there. And then we also have an IAB open session. In order to announce it here, we have it on Thursday, so after the plenary, and the IAB open session is focusing more on the technical work the IAB is doing, while today you might ask questions about some admin or strategic things. And of course, feel free whenever you have a question or comment and you don't want to use any of the open mic sessions to send email to the IAB or to the IAB chair directly, so to me. So this is the slide that we always have. Let's move to the next one. Yeah, I want to take the opportunity and make one quick announcement. The IAB is planning for a workshop on measuring network quality for end users in September. The workshop will focus on questions about how to measure and how to present this data in a meaningful way to end users, how to improve our tools and all these kind of things. There's a more extended description and call for contributions on the IAB webpage, and it was also sent to various mailing lists. The deadline for contributions is really soon. It's next Monday, but all we need is a short position paper if you have an opinion on that, and then we would be able to invite you to participate in the workshop. So have a look at that. And then the next slide. Yeah, also I would like to quickly take the opportunity to announce one of the open call for volunteers that we have right now. So the one that is still open is the one for the ICANN nomination committee. So you can volunteer yourself, or you can also nominate somebody else. We're still looking for people. We had not easy times in having a good set of candidates with a good diversity for a lot of these positions. This is not unexpected. as these positions usually need a certain kind of expertise where you have to be like an IETF member, understand the IETF, but also have to have some knowledge about the other community, and they come with certain time commitment and all these kind of things. So usually the set of volunteers is not like huge, but it is worrying that like the diversity is so low, and the only way to increase it is really to nominate yourself or talk to other people to nominate them. It takes time, but it also sometimes a very interesting experience. So please nominate yourself and nominate other people or reach out to us. And then we had made a couple of appointments since the last IETF meeting. So thank you to everybody who was newly appointed in one of these positions. That's Russ, Barry, Tim, Brian, and John. Thank you for serving, for putting your name in, and for taking up the time to serve in these positions. Okay, so that was mainly my part, but I have one more thing I want to convey here on the next slide, or the next 2 slides, I guess. If we can go to the next slide. Yeah. So you might be aware that we have the RSC Future RSC Editor Future Development Program. So that's an IAB program. However, it's more run like an open IAB IETF group, but it's just hosted by the IAB, but it's not like really that we have any authority about that. The purpose of this program is to redesign the RFC editor function. And the reason why I want to bring it up here today is because recently there was really good progress in the program, and they finally adopted a document which has like rough contents on a basic structure. So this is really the right time to contribute, to look at the document, and see if you have any input for the group. As I said, it's an open group. You can just join the mailing list. You can participate in the discussion and in the meetings, and there will be one meeting tomorrow. And then on the next slide, I provide you a very, very brief overview about, what this new model is about. So there will be a little bit new structure here. So instead of having only basically one RSC editor and the RSC production center, the group converged on having the so-called RSC series working group, which very much operates like a working group and decides about policy and strategic questions. And then there will be a new body, which is called the RFC Series Approval Board, which approves any of the document that are done in this working group. And then that means that we still will have some RFC series editor, maybe with a different name or role description, but this position will be more advisory. That person will be part of the approval board and will be advisory to the approval board, to the RPC and the community. And the RPC, the actual operation of the whole editor function, will mainly be unchanged. So that's like a very high level overview about the changes. If you want to learn more, please have a look at the document, join the meeting tomorrow. The program is hoping to actually conclude this work by end of the year. So to engage, it's the right time now. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Miriam. And if there's any questions about the IAB part, obviously there's going to be the IAB open mic later on. Next up, we have Colin with the report from the IETF. Go ahead, Colin.
Okay, thank you, Lars. If you can have the next slide, please. Yeah, so I'm Colin Perkins. This is the IETF report. Next slide, please. So yeah, so for those who are unfamiliar with it, the IETF is a research organization which runs in parallel to the IETF and co-locates its meetings. The goal of our work is primarily to bring the research community together with the standards community and to do longer term research to complement the shorter term standards work that's happening in the IETF. If you're not familiar with the IETF and how it differs from the IETF, then RFC 7418 I would encourage you to read, which is a really nice primer for IETF participants. And the slide lists the research groups which are meeting and still to meet. Next slide, please. So in addition to the research groups, we also run a couple of activities, one of which is the Applied Networking Research Prize. This is something we organize in conjunction with the Internet Society. We get sponsorship from Comcast and from NBC Universal, and I'd certainly like to thank the sponsors for that. And the goal of the Applied Networking Research Prize is to award the to recognize and award the best recent results in applied networking research, to bring in people with interesting new ideas that are of potential relevance to the IETF and the standards community, and to bring in upcoming people that are likely to have an impact on internet standards and technologies in the future. We typically make 2 awards for the Applied Networking Research Prize at each meeting. The awards for this IETF meeting were made on Monday, which went to Rüdiger Birkner for his work on network specification and verification with a system called config2spec. And they went to Sajjad Fouladi for his work on the Salsify low latency video streaming system, video conferencing system. If you missed those talks, which were in the IETF open meeting earlier in this week, the talks are online on the website at the URL listed, along with the papers as well. Next slide, please. And the other activity we do, we organize the Applied Networking Research Workshop in conjunction with ACM SIGCOMM. This workshop concluded earlier today. It's a workshop which is, again, aimed at bringing the research community, the standards community together, trying to get some interesting ideas in applied networking research, and trying to encourage cross-fertilization between the communities. If you missed it, again, the papers and the recordings of all the talks are available on the website. I'd encourage you to take a look. There were some really nice talks, some really nice papers over the last few days. And I'd like to thank Andra and Nick and the program committee for organizing that workshop. And again, thank you to the sponsors, Comcast, Akamai, and ACM SIGCOMM. Next slide, please. Okay, that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Colin. And I see Raj is there. Raj, we're going to get to you after we're done with a few brief updates, but it's good to see that your video and audio are now working. John, go ahead, please.
Yeah, thank you. It's been a while since I've given a report, and I'm not the RFC editor. I am the temporary RFC series manager until there is an RFC editor, but I'm the closest thing you get. So here is my report. Next slide, please. Next one. So I'm going to talk about 3 things: the publishing, the language, and the XML. Next, please. Yeah, so for more than a year, we've been publishing all the RFCs using XML version 3. I think it's working reasonably well. For a while, I'm sure many authors noticed that the process slowed down some, partly due to the learning process because the editing process changed quite a lot. And also Giant Cluster 238 basically dumped the better part of a year's worth of drafts into the publication process all at once. And it took several months to chew through that. But I think that's all behind us. And the RPC is now editing at pretty much the same speed they were before the transition, and the turnaround time is about what it was before we started using v3 XML. So I think we're in pretty good shape there. Next, please. I presume most of us saw the ISG statement on inclusive language and the extensive debate that led up to that, and we've ended up with a very lightweight process. We adopted this a document from NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology, which gives advice, not instructions, about inclusive language. The editors go through and NIST has a list of possibly problematic words. When they see a word that might be an issue, they flag it, but it remains up to the authors and the stream managers. And in practice, sometimes the authors say, oh yeah, there's a better way to say that. And sometimes they say, no, it's okay. So I think, again, you know, this is people are paying attention to this, and you know, the things I've seen go by have been pretty reasonable. You know, so I am pleased to say that the inclusive language, I think, is, you know, we're making, you know, it's making our documents better without getting in the way of the publication process. Next, please. Before we had version 3 XML, we had version 2 XML. We still do have version 2 XML, even though all of the RFCs are published using version 3. Most of them are still submitted using version 2. Next slide, please, shows a slide. Yeah, so I guess the blue part shows which drafts are submitted it in V2 XML. The orange is in V3 XML, and the little bit of green stuff on the top is stuff submitted the other way. For a variety of reasons, I think it is unfortunate that most of us are still using V2. I think there's reasons for that we're working on. A big reason, for example, is the BibXML, the bibliography entries, haven't been working reliably with V3, but we now have a contract out to completely redo BibXML, so it'll work reliably with V3, and that problem will go away. And it's definitely, as I said on the previous slide, we still have a lot of tool work to do. I mean, we don't have a usable XML diff, and there's other tools that could be a lot better to make it easy to both to submit in V3 and to edit in V3. So next slide, please. Yeah, I don't expect you to read all this, but the slides are available. So we've done a whole bunch of work with V3. The vocabulary, the defined V3 vocabulary was the best we could do at the time. After a year and a half, we're probably going to make we've been looking at how does it actually work, what changes do we need to make. So we're probably going to make a few changes to it. Most of the changes are backwards compatible. There's still an open question if we make changes that are not backwards compatible, are we going to go back and revise the XML, not the text, but the XML to agree with the updated grammar, or are we just going to have a version break? But we'll be working on that later this year. And I think next slide. In the meantime, I encourage everybody to take a look at XML V3. It actually works pretty well. And here are a bunch of references you can use to understand what the vocabulary is and some of the tools we have. And there's some mailing lists to discuss it. And one final slide, so what I'm going to be doing in coming months. One is to make sure everybody understands the V3 grammar changes that we are proposing, so they don't come as a surprise. And in case we do something that people hate, we have another chance to think about it. RFC 7991 and the rest of that series defines the grammar. We need to update that. As I said, there's the question of are we going to retroactively fix the XML when we change it? And the final thing I'm doing is I'm working with Jay to see if we can work on getting better tools both for writing and editing internet drafts, because the tools we have are okay, but they could be a lot better, and particularly when you compare them to stuff that professional XML houses use. There's a lot of opportunity to make life easier for people. So that is it for my chat, and I don't know whether I take questions now, later, or never.
We have time for a few questions if you are ready for it. And we have people in the queue. I would ask you to please keep it short and on the topic of the RFC editor. Go ahead, Torles.
Don't hear anything now.
Button. No, on the inclusive language. So yeah, I was pointed by IETF to NIST, and then NIST pointed back in their references to the IETF GitHub repository, and that actually had more words, and I think
You're nothing.
Sorry, do you hear me or?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry. No. So I think that actually it's good to have references outside when they have done more work, but I think what the folks who had done that GitHub stuff started to do also looks quite useful. So keep it on. Okay. Yeah. I mean, if you look at the NIST document, I mean the GitHub thing you're referring to, which is one of they had a list of here's a bunch of other things we looked at, but NIST has their own list of words, which I think is actually longer than the one we had. And anyway, it's everything is a work in progress. If people decide there is language that is either problematic that we're not addressing, or that we're over addressing like stuff that isn't problematic, come and talk to me about it. But as it stands now, I think the balance seems pretty good. Well, I think with NIST we can't really discuss, but the GitHub issues can be discussed within the community, right? So that's the benefit. I mean, the GitHub thing is just somebody's private thing. It's not it's not a formal IETF thing. But anyway, we can talk about this offline.
All right, next thing to queue is Barry, and I'm going to cut the queue after him. John will be up as part of the IAB open mic later, so if there's more discussion on this, we can get to that. And I see Barry dropped out of the queue. Oh no, here he is.
Here he is.
I just put my hand down because because you called on me. No, I also had a comment about the inclusive language. Thanks for what you said, John. I wanted to say I fully support the inclusive language stuff and have had very good exchanges with the RFC, with the RPC staff about it, and it's all gone really well. And it is indeed suggestions, and think about it, and we'll do the right thing. And the right thing is being done. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I saw some of the discussions you had, and it was really nice to see that they were both substantive and very polite, which is I would hope the entire IETF can strive for.
Thanks, John. And
Okay,
as I mentioned, you'll be up later as part of the IAB, so if there's more questions coming up for the RFC, we can take them then. Thanks. Next up, we have Gabriel with an update from the NOMCOM. Go ahead.
Hi. Hopefully you can hear me well. I can't seem to hear anything once the mic is on, but next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is your NOMCOM full roster. We have 10 voting members on the left. They're selected through the well-known random process. And we have 7 non-voting members, and the liaisons, myself and Barbara, who was chair last year. Every one of the members here, every one of these 17 persons is working hard for you, staying up late, getting up very early, as the case may be. We have all sorts of imaginable time zones. We're working hard for you, so I'm going to have some asks at the end for each and every one of you. Next slide, please. This is what we're here to do. We're here to fill 14 positions, 6 ISG, 6 IAB, 1 each for trust and LLC. Next slide, please. How did we get here? So this year, and for the first time actually this year, we have a special process called out in RFC 8989. And what's particular about it is that we've added 2 more ways of qualifying people who could be volunteers. The first path here, attendance, is what we've always used. Usually it's been face-to-face attendance 3 out of the last 5 meetings, but remote attendance has been there since last year. So we still have it this year. We added 2 more paths. One is working group leadership. You've been a working group chair or secretary rather recently. And the third path to qualify is authorship, meaning you've written at least 2 IETF stream RFCs rather recently, or 9 internet draft that's in the editor queue. Next slide, please. So how did this experiment fare? Well, let's look at the different paths. The total number of qualified volunteers this year was 116. Of those, 63% were qualified via more than one path, meaning folks were either through attendance or authorship at the same time were qualified, that sort of thing. There's different efficacies of the different paths. Path 1, attendance, is sufficient. Basically, that qualified 113 out of 116 volunteers. Path number 2, the working with leadership, was superfluous, meaning yes, it appeared once, but path 3 was there as well. By itself, it was not something that would have qualified someone otherwise not qualified. And path 3 was there, marginal. It only qualified 3 volunteers. So based on this experiment this year, it looks like there's no justification for change. And remember, change is not for free. It has to go into the data tracker. Our very good tool support people in data track support have to take this into account, code the appropriate paths for these. So it's not for free. Next slide, please. So one thing I wanted to emphasize is that RFC 8989 calls for the ISG to lead further discussion on it, and you will see the ISG email at the bottom, where you can start sending feedback, especially if you have suggestions of what next steps should be. But one question I wanted to double check here, or maybe trigger further discussion with, is why only 116 volunteers out of a total of 1,315 qualified persons? Well, was it because of pandemic fatigue, or we did have a volunteer button that made things easier for people to volunteer instead of sending me an email? It came a little bit late, so that might have been it. Something worse, I don't know. Or maybe it's nothing to worry about, because if we go back in past NOMCOMs about a decade, we have even lower numbers. So I don't know what happened at that time. Maybe somebody here remembers. Maybe that was identified as a problem because numbers rose. So whatever we did last time, maybe we can try it again. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thanks. So we have a few milestones. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So there's basically two milestones I want to call special attention to. One is the call for nominations that's going to happen towards the end of August, at which time, please nominate people you've worked with. Here they are. So the first one is nomination. So yeah, please, when you see that announcement, nominate people, nominate yourself. And then mid-October or so, we will have another announcement asking for feedback on the nominees. These are people who you undoubtedly will have worked with, know, have good or bad experience. Please let us know. Good feedback is great. Bad feedback, of course, is also very useful. Help us reflect the community. It's not just about nominees, but about the process, whatever. And just to emphasize a very, very important point, all this feedback is confidential to the NOMCOM, to the 17 people you saw in the roster. Next slide, please. So here you have pointers with further information. One piece of information I want to leave you with is that on Friday, we have office hours. We'll be on GatherTown. You can find us on the agenda. So I hope to see you all there. Thank you.
Thanks, Gabriel. And I think we have time for a few questions from NOMCOM. I first want to thank the volunteers, though. It's a really important job for the organization, and it's a lot of work. And it's, you know, volunteering for this is important, but it's often a thankless job, and I want to make sure that we're thanking you guys for taking this on for the health of the organization. I also want to briefly mention that so RFC 8989 calls on the ISG to prepare a report to the community on the results of the experiment in consultation with Gabriel and Barbara. And we're going to do this, if I remember correctly, the deadline we were sort of thinking about is sometime early September. So you will see something written up and announced, based on what Gabriel showed you in terms of data. You can, as he said, email the ISG with your thoughts on whether we should. I think the options that RFC 8989 calls for are either we stop the experiment, we can extend the experiment for another year, or we can do something else. If you have thoughts on what we should be doing here, please let us know. All right, I have two people in the queue, Spencer and Mike St. John's. I'm going to already cut the queue after Mike, but Spencer, go ahead.
I wanted to say thank you, Gabe, for serving the community in the way you're serving, and Lars as well, of course. You mentioned the thing about the cost of tooling changes and things like that with changes to the NOMCOM process, and you would know that much better than I would. The thing I wanted to be sure and mention was historically there's a really narrow window between when you are organizing a NOMCOM and when you could actually start using changed rules. When we did the open list change to the NOMCOM process a bunch of years ago, we didn't quite make it the year that it was approved, and so we ended up waiting like 10 months to be able to to be able to use that change as well. And so that was that's, I just wanted to be sure and mention that as well. Thank you.
Mike, go ahead.
Hi. I crunched the numbers, and we talked about some of this on the mailing list. The biggest decrease in the set of volunteers for this non-com came from the individuals and small and two-party companies, if you will, that participate in the IETF by far. About 30% of the a good portion of the decrease was there. So next time around, if you can spare the time, people, this is a good thing to volunteer, and it affects a lot of things going forward. So,
Thank you. Thanks, Gabriel. Next up is Jay and Jason with the LLC part of the agenda. Go ahead, Jay.
Thanks. Next slide, please. And next slide again. So I want to start off by thanking the IETF 111 host, Juniper Networks, for hosting this meeting. As Lars said, it's good that companies understand the value proposition of being hosts of fully online meetings. And going to take this opportunity now just to give Raj Yavatka the chance to come back and do his presentation from earlier. Over to you, Raj.
Very happy to join you. Can you hear me? I join you on behalf of Juniper Networks, who's hosting the IETF. And as you all know, Juniper has been very active in IETF for a long time. My own association with IETF started as a graduate student, long time back. When I was a student of Dr. Comer at Purdue, and IETF was a very small community, maybe about 40 people used to show up. I had the fortune to be associated with working groups such as RSVP with Lisha Zhang, Differentiated Services with Kathy Nichols. I started 2 working groups, one called RAP, which led to a protocol called COPS, and Forces, which was a precursor to OpenFlow, which was doing forwarding and control element separation. So I think very happy to join you. I think we at Juniper strongly believe that the IETF culture and the methods of making decisions using consensus are the democratic principles that we strongly support. I also like the way the IETF is managed. I still remember Fred Baker, who used to wear a T-shirt on the first day of the IETF, which said, lead, follow, or get out of the way. And I have really liked that. I saw names like Mike Sendons, Christian Huitema on the chart. These are the stalwarts of IETF. So whatever small role I played, I'm very proud of that. My only encouragement or request to IETF community is that you guys are responsible for stewardship of the IP architecture. There are lots of new noises about starting alternatives to IP. And IP has withstood the test of time for a good reason. So I want to thank you all for continued stewardship of IP architecture. Please keep it up. And thank you, Lars.
No, thank you, Raj. It's always good to see that a CTO of a large organization like Juniper Networks sort of knows the IETF and has participated in the past. This is sort of really showing like how far, in some sense, the internet and the IETF have come over the years. So thank you very much for your long support of the IETF.
Yes, thank you, Raj. So that was Raj Yavatka, the CTO of Juniper Networks, one of our global hosts and the host of this meeting. And Juniper have also just extended their global host agreement further and blogged about that and their support of the IETF, which is excellent. Thank you. Next slide, please. So thank you to our equipment and services sponsors. Cisco, Juniper, and WebEx. The value of equipment that Cisco and Juniper provide for us for managing these meetings is really quite extraordinary, and the services as well. So thank you very much for that. Next slide, please. This time round, we have two gold diversity and inclusivity sponsors, Akamai and Cisco. Our new sponsorship program is based around some values that companies can choose which particular values they wish to support to align with their own internal values. And we're seeing a lot of support on the diversity and inclusivity. So thank you, Akamai and Cisco, for that. Next slide, please. And thank you to our bronze diversity and inclusivity sponsors, Comcast and Donuts and ICANN. To our running code sponsor, ICANN as well. And to VeriSign, who've come in as a local sponsor, even though we're online. And that's very good of them because we're moving these things forward that way. Right. So thank you again to all of our sponsors. This has been a very well supported meeting. Previous meetings have had some good support, but we're really getting momentum behind with our sponsors supporting these online meetings. Thank you. Next slide, please. So to thank the many generous volunteers, the Code Sprint volunteers, long list of those. We hold those a bit further out from the meetings than when we have in-person meetings, but we're still holding the Code Sprints. And for the NOC volunteers and of course to the organisations that support the NOC volunteers and make it possible for them to dedicate so much time to working on IETF. Thank you. Next slide, please. And then we have quite a team in the background, Secretariat team, who many are aware of, and who are available inside gather.town for anything that you need to talk about. The NOC team, who have been working hard, and of course the Meet Echo team, who you will see in many of the sessions working on things. The tools team continues to go strong, so thank you to people who work on that, and to our contractors and staff there, and the LLC has grown slightly, and so thank you to LLC staff. Next slide, please. So next week we are making the decision about IETF 112 Madrid, and then announcing that on the Monday afterwards. Obviously this is a difficult time for us all, so we're not sure whether we were going ahead with that. The one commitment we will make is that if we're not able to go ahead with it, then we will rebook Madrid for a proper in-person meeting at some point in the future, just so that Madrid doesn't miss out in that way. There are still sponsorship opportunities available, so please contact sponsorship@ietf.org for anything there. Next slide, please. So thank you to all of our global hosts. As a reminder, global hosts sign up with us generally for 6 or 9 years. They make a significant annual contribution, and they then host one or more meetings during their time as a host. And so together they provide us significant income that we need in order to be able to run meetings. So thank you to Cisco, Comcast, Ericsson, Huawei, Juniper Networks, NBC Universal, and Nokia. Thank you. Next slide, please. So this is our upcoming list of meetings. We, of course, have Madrid, and then next year, Bangkok and Philadelphia. And we're all, I'm sure, desperately hoping that we will definitely be able to hold those in person, and no doubt about those. 115 in Europe, we spent a long time working with a particular venue only for the first time ever to break down, and so we're now putting in place a backup venue, but which we hope to announce quite soon. 116 in Asia, that's delayed by COVID. We have somewhere largely set up, but in order for us to be able to finish off the negotiations and things, we need their tourism industry to restart, which it hasn't yet properly restarted, or the conference industry at least. And 119 in Asia, we have a potential for that as well. So these things are moving forward quite well. Next slide, please. So here's the breakdown of the number of people that have come along and how that meets up against our budget. So we've done reasonably well altogether against budget. Again, we have people who deliberately use the late registration in order to be able to pay us more. Thank you very much for that. That's very good of you. And we've had many more one-day passes than we expected this time round. Thank you. Next slide, please. And so here are the 4 staff members. So you have me on the left, looking slightly younger than I do now, Greg Wood, who's been around for a long time, Director of Communications and Operations, and then we too have our 2 new starters, Lee Berkeley-Shaw, who's our Director of Development. Development in this context means fundraising and things, and Lee Berkeley has a long history of this, having previously been with Centre for Democracy and Technology. And we have Kasara Rathnayaki, who is our Senior Software Development Engineer, who's an open source developer, skilled in full stack development through Python and JavaScript and like, and who is now beginning to take over some of the previous tools work. So that's it for our team. Next slide, please. Over to Jason.
All right, great. Thank you, Jay. Appreciate it. Welcome. Next slide, please. This is the LC board report. So no changes here from the last meeting. Still the same folks here from the March meeting. So you can see all of our pictures here. Next slide, please. And these are our upcoming board meetings. One note here is that on August 11th, we have our second of 2 IASA 2 retrospective webinars. So as you know, that consultation is open. I'll mention it again in just a moment, but worth bearing in mind that that is slightly different from a normal board meeting in terms of agenda and so on. So the other ones are typical board meetings. We should do this in advance. Next slide, please. Slide. There we go. So here is the current work that we're focused on really since the last meeting. We've completed our 2020 financial review and audit. Had another second year now clean audit report, which was great news. Thanks, Sean, for coordinating all of that with the auditors. We also recently began the IASA 2 3-year retrospective. So for folks that don't know what that is, in essence, when we had this IASA 2 structure in place, we were asked to do a retrospective after 3 years. So I'm breaking up a little bit. Sorry about that. We've done a strengths weaknesses type of assessment as well, and we formalized an email policy for staff accounts. Next slide. And these are the financials as they stand today. The only note here really is the difference between the revenue and the budget versus actual. And that was explained at the end of last fiscal year because of when the ISOC contribution was recognized, which actually came late in the fiscal year instead of in this year as expected. Next slide. And there's our contact information. I think that should be all. Thank you. And Lars, I don't know if you want me to take folks in the queue. I see we have one person.
I was going to suggest we wait because we have the LLC open mic later on, unless it's urgent, okay. Spencer. Okay. I'll let you decide.
Right, thank you. So I'm just going to present the results of the recent IETF community survey that we've conducted. We have a draft report out, and the consultation on that is still open for a while longer, and we'll then issue a final report. The presentation I'm going to give now includes changes that have already been recommended to us. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So it had a threefold purpose. First was to give us some demographics around the IETF. Then some planning data that can be used by various parts of IETF leadership. And then the first part of a time series so that we can then begin to assess the natural changes affecting the IETF and the effectiveness of major programs, organizational changes and leadership actions. Next slide, please. So 4 key design principles. We wanted wide distribution, so we sent it to every subscriber to an IETF list, even if that list had been idle for a number of years, which is 56,000 addresses in total. We wanted it to be simple for people to respond to, with the careful language, no opinion options, and only one mandatory question. Wanted it to be actionable and direct, which meant no free text answers. We couldn't read through 2,000 of those and make those actionable. And no questions about fuzzy perceptions that we couldn't really deal with. And we also wanted it to be repeatable and relevant. So we didn't ask questions that could be asked in other ways. Next slide, please. So we had 2,032 valid responses, giving a margin of error of plus or minus 2%. But the big disclaimer, of course, is that the respondents to this survey were self-selected, not randomly chosen, and the details of the population are not well known enough for us to determine if this sample is truly representative. So this is a take it at face value, use it as you see fit type survey. Next slide, please. So key findings for the organisation. First, great news here. The IETF mostly delivers its mission and principles. Quality and relevance of our RFCs are good, focus of the work is acceptable, consensus is strong, and the ability to share views is acceptable. So some core things about how the IETF works are validated by this. The IETF processes are mostly acceptable, with the standout exception being the slowness of the entire IETF process. And then we have an issue with mass communication, which is partly a bootstrapping problem that not enough people know about IETF announce, but we also have other more complex issues about what content people want to see and how they like to receive their content. Next slide, please. So here is a little chart using coding mean, which is explained in the reports. Higher means that people prefer it more. It shows different ways about the people wish to be informed of their activities and shows you by age. And so if you look at blog posts and you look at social media posts, I mean, it makes me smile just how you see that distribution of age across those. The older you are, the least you prefer blog posts and social media posts. But in the top right, the strong cluster of people who prefer prefer email. And to answer the question, yes, we have an under 18 age bracket. We asked that question. We had 2 people, I think, come back in that. And that's important for us to understand things such as the ability of people to consent to contracts and things like that. Next slide, please. So key findings about people. The IETF has a sense of community, but only just. And people don't feel that they can recommend the IETF, which I will show you on a slide in a moment. The IETF has a big problem with gender. Females make up 10% of the IETF report community, which is much less than both, of course, general population and employees within IT-related fields, and are disproportionately deterred by the culture of the IETF, less likely to feel treated the same as the rest of the community as males, less likely to feel their contributions are valued, and less likely to feel that the behaviour of other participants is acceptable. So we have a problem there. We have a smaller problem with regionality, but we have no problem with age. Next slide, please. So this is using a Net Promoter Score, which is a methodology you may not be familiar with, where we ask people to score from 0 to 10. How likely are you to recommend IETF participation to a friend or colleague? Those who score 9 or 10 are promoters, and then the scale is down below. And you generally subtract detractors from promoters, and in this case we have a negative score, which is terrible in Net Promoter Score terminology or methodology for working that out. So while people have a lot of positive things to say about being here, they don't really want to inflict it on others, which is very interesting. Next slide, please. And here are some examples of the gender split I talked about, the ability to share my views and treated the same as the rest of the IETF community. Next slide, please. Key findings on participation. The principle of people participating for the benefit of the internet is true, but it's not the strongest factor. Come back to in a minute, but the strongest factor is actually people for their own personal development and learning. The foundations of people participating as individuals is very complex. It's partially supported, but only partially supported, and more work is needed to understand that. Support for new modes of participation, such as issue trackers or instant messaging, is limited and very age dependent. And two key pillars of using email for everything and using English as a standard language have very strong support, surprisingly strong support. Next slide, please. So why did you participate in the IETF? This question was asked differently of different people. My personal interest is, you can see at the top, and then to make the internet work better, and then professional development. And you can see two of the interesting bits about my job allowing me to, my job requiring me to. My job allowing me to coming out significantly higher there. Which is interesting because we have a number of people who believe that there are people who maneuver into jobs that enable them to work within the IETF. Next slide, please. And key findings finally about the wider environment. We find that the IETF is a very important part of a well-connected ecosystem, and that people think it compares very positively compared to other standard setting organizations. So again, this is using Net Promoter Score methodology here, and the promoters, minus detractors, gives us a very high score there for how important is IETF development of the internet. Next slide, please. So finally, just about the next steps of this survey. The survey was conducted on behalf of the ISG and with some IETF LLC concerns addressed in there as well. And it will be used by the ISG and LLC over the next year in order to plan and carry out work. And I'm hoping that we'll see the survey regularly referenced in decision making to ensure that we have a data-driven approach. What I'm particularly hoping is that some things will be no longer sources of angst, because we know that we will have that evidence is that they're not an issue, and other areas that are sometimes dismissed will be opened up a little bit better. One action that we've already taken is to add a sign-up link to the to IETF Announce to the mailing list, that welcome email. And this survey will be repeated annually with some adjustments so that we build up the time series of data, but we're almost certainly going to do a big cleaning up exercise of mailing lists before then, leading to a smaller total population, and that will affect things in future. Next slide, please. That's it. So thank you all that took part. And if you wish to discuss this further or provide feedback on it, then on the admin discuss mailing list, please. Thank you. Over to you, Lars.
Thanks, Jay. I think this brings us to the open mic part. So next slide. Right, this is the ISG. Mics are open. Please get in line and ask your questions. And if you can, turn your video on too. And as a reminder, there's an open mic coming for the IAB and for the LLC after this. So if you have topics for them, hold. This is the ISG. Andrew, go ahead, please.
Hi, Lars. I'm not sure if this is correctly addressed to the ISG, but I will ask you, you'll no doubt redirect me if not. I noticed that there have been quite a few issues raised on some of the different mailing lists over the last few weeks on the use of GitHub versus mailing lists, and whether different working groups are getting the balance right. And seems to me from the comments that for whatever reason, some of the current working practices are not satisfactory without making judgments as to in what direction. And I wondered if you thought this is something that the ISG needs to re-evaluate to give more consistent guidance across the working groups.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So this came up at least one issue or one spot where it came up was on gender dispatch, and it was my individual draft. So we had a GitHub working group that closed that defined some guidelines for how working groups can use GitHub in the IETF, and it sort of leaves us in a position where each individual working group basically decides for themselves if they're using GitHub and how they're using GitHub. And I guess what I can't recall whether we had a discussion about is whether a working group that doesn't make a active decision, what goes for them, right? So Gen Dispatch, for example, in this case, as far as I know, doesn't have a stated policy for how GitHub is to be used. And so in this particular case, I have an individual draft that I use GitHub for, and I posted a link with a pull request that contained a proposed change to the document. And discussion happened on GitHub, and there was some confusion on whether this was wanted or not, and why it wouldn't be an email. I'll point out that for working groups that basically configure GitHubs as an organization, it's possible to set up a mailing list such that all the discussion on GitHub gets reflected there. Quick did this for the quick-issues mailing list. You've seen it mentioned earlier because we excluded it from the stats that Alvaro showed, because it's by far the most busy IETF list, and it's sort of automatically generated email mostly. But at least it allows people that don't want to interact with GitHub to at least follow the discussion. But it requires a working group to actively have a GitHub organization and configure it a certain way. So it's not something you can do for an individual draft, which is a little bit of a problem. So I'm wondering if other people have an opinion on this. One thing that I've seen proposed is whether the GitHub working group should be reopened with an extended charter or a revised charter. That's certainly something we could do. But I'm not sure how much consensus there would be for doing something more than we did in the existing GitHub working group a while ago, because the community is quite split on the question of whether GitHub should be used and how much. I see Brandon in the queue. Brandon, are you on the same topic, or is this a different question?
It's related.
It's related. Then go ahead.
So I wonder if this would be less of an issue if there were an IETF-hosted issue tracker and Git host available.
So it's been discussed, and I think, for example, we even have a GitLab license for the IETF that we could take into action. One of the arguments that has been brought up is that being on GitHub as the sort of large place where a lot of open source gets developed makes it easy for people who are already on GitHub to participate on IETF documents. And we've sort of anecdotally seen this for the quick working group, where individuals that hadn't participated in the IETF found the repository somehow and opened issues and made comments, and then we never saw them again. So this sort of drive-by participation is something that GitHub enables, and if we would host our own setup, that wouldn't be possible. We can certainly, have a discussion about how frequent that happens and how important it is for the organization. But it's been brought up and discussed. I don't think there was consensus on it. But GitLab would be something that's available, and other Git hosting solutions exist too.
I see. Thank you.
Thanks. Jeff Houston. Brendan, you're still in the queue. I will remove you if you want to talk again. Okay, now you're gone. Jeff, go ahead.
Okay, to move on to it. I'm bringing up, I suppose, a question that arose in the CyberOps working group earlier today, or yesterday, depending on where you live in this world. And it's actually about what running code actually means. The CyberOps working group is certainly grappling with that, taking the lead from other working groups that appeared to say, you really need implementation reports in order to advance a draft. But in some ways, that's not quite good enough these days. And what we find, of course, is the internet is working at such a scale that it has its own stasis and resistance to incorporating what we'd call experimentation. Now, when you say this has implementation, do you mean this spec is good enough for independent implementations to interoperate? Full stop. In other words, the spec is a reasonable guideline for code, but as to whether you should deploy it or not, or it's a good thing, someone else's problem. Or you could say this specification creates independent implementations that operate at scale and makes the internet better, and you should build it. Now, there's a whole bunch of different opinions out there. The DNS certainly appears in those working groups to take the position that, internet drafts are purely ephemeral. I'll implement it when it's an RFC and not before, because, you know, it's hard to chase butterflies. Whereas others appear to be saying all the rigor and indeed even some element of acceptance of this as a good idea should come at the working group and draft level. And what should come out of the IETF are RFCs that bless history. This is a tough question, and I think punting this to individual working groups to actually resolve severally, diversely, and independently is entirely wrong for the IETF. These mixed signals are not only confusing, I tend to suggest that they create such a mixed quality of outcome, it actually devalues the RFCs. Lowest common denominator rules tend to apply. What's the IETF, IESG think about this? And are they willing to actually reopen what running code actually means for the IETF and its working groups? Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. Does anybody on the IETF who participated in this group want to speak to this? I see Alvaro wants to start to share. No. Yes, go ahead, Alvaro.
If I'm with myself everywhere, I can actually say something. Yeah, this has come up before, and I think that, yes, ideally we would have running code for many things before we publish. There are some working groups, Jeff, that I know you're familiar with, IDR, for example, that requires 2 independent implementations. We've had a ton of discussions with the chairs and others about what does an implementation mean. In general, you know, we want an actual vendor who provides backbone software, for example, when we're talking about BGP, right? The last thing we want to do is break BGP. However, and this goes to your point about leaving independent working groups to make the decisions. In my mind, at least, I do think that is the right way to do it. The reason is that different working groups serve different markets, different segments, and not all of them are going to go do implementations before things are standardized. Many working groups that work maybe with governments, for example, these manufacturers are going to wait until there's an RFC, until the spec has been completely approved before they do implementations. So I think that the part of the issue here is that one size doesn't fit all. Now that we have, I don't know, we're 120 working groups, it is very, very hard to come up with one solution that's going to fit everyone.
Thanks, Alvaro. Next up in the queue is Dominique. Dominique, go
Sorry.
ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to go back to the presentation on the survey, and I noticed in the chat there were a couple questions that I was going to ask out loud. One is,
could I ask you to wait with that until the LLC is up? Because
oh yeah, sorry about that. Okay, thank you.
Jeff's back in the queue. Go ahead.
To Alvaro here, in making the observation that individual working groups have to interpret what they see as running code in their own, at times, unique way, I actually don't think that flexibility to that degree, serves the IETF in a general sense. I actually think you need to refine what we mean by running code and work out the difference between a spec that is implementable and a spec that is a good idea for customers to use, and work out how running code relates to that. Because at the moment, as I said, I think that degree of variation is actually harmful to this process and to the quality of its output. And simply saying it's somebody else's problem, working groups should make their own way through this mess, isn't exactly the degree of helpful guidance that normally I would have expected from you worthy folk on the IESG. Thank you.
So, Jeff, I would say, I mean, you're asking a very important question, which is, what are the means we can arrive at to have confidence in the specs that we're going to publish? I think certainly code is one of those, but one of the other things I would kind of emphasize, with the enthusiasm that you have, is that, for example, formal verification in the security area has been transformative to make sure that the spec or even the code that we're producing, that's those reference implementations, has really changed the game for us and largely table stakes for the introduction of new protocols for us. And to the question of scale, I know prior working groups have also elicited the academic community for things like ModSim to make sure that we understand those protocols at scale as well without the deployment. So I think there's a number of levers we should be pushing for to make sure the quality is high. Thanks.
Thanks. John Clemson is next. Go ahead, John.
Jeff, I'm very sympathetic to the argument you're raising. I think it's important, but it seems to me that the argument you're making and the distinctions you're asking for are exactly why we started down the path of a three-step standards process about a century ago. And I note that for better or worse, we've never been able to make that work. I wish we could. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Torles, go ahead.
So having been on both the development, deployment, and the standardization side, I think I'd like to chime into what Alvaro said with respect to that you can't simply say one size fits all, right? So depending on where you're actually working in the standardization, the overhead to just do an experiment in implementing something that ultimately turns out not to be useful has been shown to be very, very expensive in cases. And so you actually, may want to have standardization pre-go the implementation to really work out quirks before you do investments, right? So obviously that's not everywhere true, right? The more something is, very easy to implement software, the more the opposite is true. But I certainly don't think that, one size fits all.
Thanks, Carlos. And I see an empty queue for the ISG. Any further questions for them, us? Okay, thank you all. Next up is, I think, the IAB mic. So can we get the next slide, please? And the next slide. And this is your IAB, and Miria is there, and questions are coming.
Yes, I'm back. This is the IAB. We don't do an introduction round because of time, but you can see faces and names, and we can start the queue. And this is also the point of time where you can ask questions to John again if you want.
Going once. Andrew.
There, thanks, Andrew.
Sorry, I was waiting to see if Dominic was coming in then, but I think she's maybe on the next one. I have two questions, if I may. First is, I think the excellent RFC 8890 informational document on the Internet is for End Users talked about the importance of multi-stakeholder consultation. And I wondered if there'd been any subsequent thoughts on actually developing a process to do this, because I think there are certainly a number of working groups where there's a need for multi-stakeholder consultation, and I think it potentially becomes quite a barrier to doing it if each develops its own process. So some guidance on how I think would be welcome. And then secondly, to my other question, I think last time I raised a question around so concerns around centralization, and how some of the proposed standards working through the system seem to be in danger of making that worse, not better, and whether there are any plans to assess the centralization impacts of new standards before they're introduced alongside security impacts. I don't think I've seen progress on that, and would welcome views on what's going to be done to actually sort of take centralization risk seriously. Thank you.
Okay, let me start on your first part. So I don't think we have like a specific process for consulting multi-stakeholder organizations or parties, but we do discuss a lot, on the one hand, how to better manage our liaisons, how to better outreach, how to better utilize them, how to have a better overview of what's happening at all. And we also have some discussion about how to improve our outreach, and there are multiple dimensions of this. This is like advertising what the IETF is doing in other organizations, getting feedback, getting people involved, and getting new people involved, also attracted to the IETF. But these are all different aspects with different answers, and we're just starting the discussion. So I don't have like an answer to you, but it's still on our radar, but it's also not like an easy solution, like how to improve the situation here. It's more in the assessment phase. I don't know if somebody else from the IAB wants to add something. Tell me.
Yeah, I'd be happy to also, can I chime into the second half of the question here? Yeah.
And let me figure out if Yari wants. He's probably also here for the second half. So let's go on with that.
Yeah. Yeah. Just for the point about what can we do for concerns about centralization, et cetera. It is definitely something that we've discussed as the IB and in retreats, et cetera. Well, just one of the practical items that we've been going through an exercise of that we're still working on is a list of things, centralization just being one small part of that, that the IB should be reviewing during BOF chartering, working group chartering, anytime we have new work coming in, just as a way to kind of look at kind of the bigger picture of how do these pieces fit together, and are there things that may not come up in other types of review that we think should be on the list that the IAB comes back to. So that's definitely one of the items that's in there, and at some point we'll formalize this list and then it'll be public, but we're already thinking about it as we are looking at new work coming into the IETF.
And then Yari, I'm pretty sure you want to add something on this point. You can just turn on your video.
Yeah, so Tommy said basically what I wanted to say, but maybe add a few things. One is that I think many of us actually do care quite a bit in the IETF and IAB as well about centralization, consolidation issues, but it's sort of difficult item to deal with. You have to discuss the specific of these cases. So yesterday, for instance, we had a big discussion on impacts of discovery or not in one of the BOFs that we had this week, and whether there's an issue depends on exactly what the use cases are and how we end up using a particular technical design. So I think it's at the top of our minds, or at least it's one of the things that we care about. But we have to discuss the specific cases in detail, and there's like no direct golden rule that says, do this, don't do that. Thank you.
Wes, you want to add something?
Yeah, so
one thing to note about, the internet being for the end users, right? One of the things that we are doing right now is actually going to be holding a workshop on measuring network quality for end users, and that is right in line with our goal to figure out how do we get a better sample rate for how things are impacting end users, right? The call for papers for that is open right now. It's linked off of the IAB website, and I'd strongly encourage people to submit papers for it. The due date is actually August 2nd, which is coming up quickly, but they don't need to be long papers. Just what are your thoughts around that? And you can go read the call for papers. I'll drop it in the chat too. Thanks.
So as Andrew just mentioned in chat that he would like to have more guidance, maybe send us a separate email to the IAB and we can figure out what you're actually looking for. And if that is covered somehow by our liaison management, or if you're actually looking for something else, that would be helpful. Thanks. And then, Sorin, were you trying to join the queue, or we can see a video? Okay, so then we have more space on the queue if anybody else wants to ask a question.
Okay, doesn't look like it, which leaves us a few minutes for the LLC board. If we can go to the next slide, and then I guess the next slide afterwards.
Thank you.
This is the LLC board. I want to ask Dominique to come back to the front of the queue. There she is already. Perfect. Thank you, Dominique.
Thanks. Sorry about the bad timing with the jet lag and everything. Yeah, so basically going back to the survey, as I was mentioning, just a question on what is being done to potentially address the gender issues, and also the issue that was brought up in parallel about feeling welcome or inclusivity. Thanks.
Well, shall I go with that first then? At this stage, Dominic, we're just getting the results together. The response obviously needs to have part IESG response and part LLC response. I can't speak for the IESG, Lars will do that. Within the LLC, when the consultation is finished and we've got the final report out there, we'll be having some form of conversation about that. Jason, did you want to add anything? No. So, I mean, it is something that we recognise and do take seriously. It's something we've been talking about for quite some time, which is why the questions appeared the way they did in the survey, because we wanted to make sure that we had the data to validate what for many of us was an instinctive understanding. And so taking that forward now, I think we've got a very clear mandate, I think, across the organisation, though we have, of course, different roles in the organisation as to how we do that, but there's a clear mandate to understand that and do something about that. Lars, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I can only say that, I mean, the results came in a few weeks ago, and the ISG was obviously in the ramp up to the IETF meeting, so we've sort of looked at it and we've discussed it certainly, but we haven't simply have the time to sit down on a chat to dig down and decide what we're going to do with these results. But I agree with Jay and others that the results are sort of eye-opening, and I think they certainly motivate an action by the organization and by the community to improve the scores that we have in some of those categories. I was quite surprised that the outcome was that drastic. Are there any further questions for the LLC board? It doesn't look like it. In that case, can we go next slide just to make sure that I don't forget anything?
One quick comment. There was some discussion in the chat that I just wanted to make sure folks took note of. It was about the mechanisms by which people can provide feedback to the board on the IASA 2 retrospective. And as noted in the blog, we're happy to take it via email on admin discuss, via GitHub, the upcoming second webinar or office hours or GatherTown this week. Any of those are fine, and if you have some other method you'd like to have a one-on-one, we're happy to do that as well.
Okay, thanks. Next slide, please. Or is this the last one? I'm hoping it's the last one. I think it's the last one. So that brings us to the end of the plenary. Thank you all very much, especially my fellow Europeans for whom it is approaching sunrise out there. And enjoy the rest of your IETF week. And I certainly hope we get to see each other in person again very soon. Good night and good day. See you soon.